So my name is Ismail Chaib. I run the operation for a German-based company called TESOBE. 5 years ago, we started something called the Open Bank Project with this idea of helping banks around the world expose APIs and work with fintech startups.
Open banking is not about public APIs. Open banking is really about open APIs. It's about giving the possibility for third parties to access. But it is a possibility. There are conditions to do that, right? So there are, the third parties needs to register, it needs to be accepted, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is one of the key misconceptions here about open banking. So, and there are four I want to tackle and sort of dispel, right? The first one, most important, in all my discussions, open APIs means public API. That's completely wrong. An open API, an open banking program is about offering the possibility for third parties to access. It's not about free for all, everyone can come and get my data and do everything they want with it. No, it's just giving the technology infrastructure to enable this conversation. In the end, it's the bank choosing, it's the regulatory framework deciding, if any, and it's importantly, it's the end user deciding, right? So nothing happens, nothing works in this whole open banking world if there is not the consent of the end user. So everything is driven by the consent of the end user. Again, very key misconception. I want you all to forget about public APIs are not open APIs. The second one is open banking disintermediate the bank. Well, not necessarily. It might be that open banking, in that future of third-party partners providing services to the end user, it might be that it disintermediate the bank. Of course, there is a chance that happens, but not necessarily, right? It could be quite the contrary. It could be an open banking program could be designed or could be a way for you as a bank to strengthen your position, to be at the center of all the interaction with the customers, right? So you could be some sort of app store so your customers would come to you to cherry pick, to choose the apps that works for them, right? And they trust you that you find the good apps for them. Similar to, this is a kind of a typical platform play. Amazon, the Apple App Store, and so many others lead the way here, sort of give us guidelines and examples on how that works. The third one, I think pretty obvious to all of us, open banking is definitely not just a technical program. If you want it to work, you need to involve business key stakeholders from the business side. You need to involve, it's really cross-sector. It's no longer a siloed thing. It really needs to have buy-in and support from different parts of the business. And another very common one is, open banking, we already offer APIs. We've been doing this for 20 years. No, you've not. You're not. You have been providing APIs for 20 years. That's true. You've probably been providing these sort of private APIs, host-to-host access, and which is great. But what we're talking about today with this open API wave, with this open banking wave, is something radically different. For the first time in the history of the bank, we are giving access to people we don't necessarily know already. We don't have trust. These are not partners of ours that we've contracted with to do certain tasks. These are people who build something and want to plug it to our system. So I think this is really different. And the two key challenges that this brings, the first one is security, obviously. We don't trust that third party, so how can we ensure trust, ensure there is no security breaches and so on. So trust is it's a different level. And the second challenge is around the developer experience. The people, the third parties accessing our data and our services are from outside the banking industry. In most cases, these are young tech talents, maybe. They don't necessarily have 20 years experience in banking. You can't expect them to have the training that your staff have in terms of using your internal system, legacy, and so on. So the experience you need to offer to these guys, if you want them to use your systems and to use your services, is going to be radically different and needs to be rethought. So again, you've probably been offering some form of APIs and so on, but you've not been offering open banking APIs as we understand them today. And there's a certain number of technical standards and expectations that we'll go through afterwards that are not being offered in most cases today. So this is for the misconceptions, right? Like, so let's talk about why a bank, and again, I'll try to go very quickly on this one. So why a bank needs to do an API program, different benefit, it's it might generate new revenue stream, it's a way to do partnership at scale, to speed up partnerships, it's a way to outsource your R&D to this army of third-party partners who are keen to create new services that your customers can use. Open banking, there's really an interesting use case here as well, and this is also what open banking enables that hasn't been possible before. You can do micro segmentation, right? So with open banking, I mentioned this example yesterday. Let's talk about visually impaired people, right? So what about an app that speaks to me the balance instead of showing it, right? It's very useful if you're a visually impaired person. Doesn't make sense for a bank to build that. It's really tiny market. But because of open banking, you might have a startup that builds an app for visually impaired people, another one that builds an app for the elderly, another one which builds an app for migrants, etc., etc., etc. So suddenly you're able to target these micro segments in a very effective way without so much cost on your side. All right, and I think that's really where the opportunity lies here. Why particularly we're talking about this now? I think customers are changing, that's obvious. There are lots of fintechs coming and sort of competing with the bank, so how does a bank react to that? Not just fintechs, big techs as well is really interesting. I think Alipay, the Facebook, the Amazon of the world, that's really where the threat is coming from. And you have an aging IT system, so you can't really cope with the changes that the customers are asking for. So instead of throwing everything starting from scratch, which in many cases is not possible, you can have a layer on top, an API layer on top that gives you the flexibility that the customer wants. But by far the most important driver for the discussion today is regulation. So around the world there is a regulatory pressure, regulators forcing banks to open up APIs. Gartner says that over 50% of the G20 countries will open APIs or will have an open banking regime by the end of this year. It started in 2013, 2014 in the UK, in Europe as well with the revised Payment Service Directive, PSD2, and then it's spreading everywhere, right? So New Zealand, of course, but Australia, Mexico, South Korea, etc. PSD2 is really, so that's really where it started, right? And there's an interesting regulation. It basically says that all the banks in Europe, or the entities with the banking license over 10,000, should open up access to account information, transactions, and payment services. And as long as the third party is authorized, the third party has to have access. So the bank can't say, no, we don't give access to this company because they're competing with our product. You have to give them access as long as they are authorized by the regulator. So really interesting program. There's if you want to look at the details of it, there's something called the PSD2 is a directive. It means it just states the aim of the regulator of the program, and then each member country in the EU needs to implement it and translate it into national law in kind of slightly different way. However, they also produce something called the RTS, the Regulatory Technical Specification, I think. But the RTS explain, I think in 35 articles, explain exactly what it means to have an API, what's the security model behind it, and so on and so forth. So really interesting to have a read to understand what the EU, how the EU is looking at this. It started in July 2013, and it's meant to be to start being transposed into law. Again, each country transpose it into law separately, starting from January this year. So it's an ongoing process. And it introduces something called the strong customer authentication. So basically there is an added level of security when it comes to certain operations within these APIs. So if you make a payment over 30 euros, there is a second factor authentication which needs to be done. There are like all sorts of rules like that which are in place to do this second factor authentication. And you can't charge for these APIs, and I think that's important. So banks have to give away the data for free, at least this specific scope about access to account, transaction, and so on, for free. This is obviously huge. Like all the discussions today in Europe in banking are around PSD2. How do we comply? How can we make something out of it? So really has an important impact. I think 88% of the managers, banks in Europe, think that it will have an impact. 64 think it's a kind of a negative impact. And there are others, right? There are, I think today, about 12 countries and jurisdictions who have such a regulation. The trends that we see in these regulations are two. So one is we're moving towards kind of a bottom-up, what I call a bottom-up approach. So regulators not really pushing for this as a law, but really leaving it to the market to decide and bring it and kind of making it happen. Case in point, New Zealand. And the second trend is towards standardization. So as we go, we see more and more of these countries kind of working towards a standard. So a common list of interfaces that all the banks will share. Right? Again, case in point, New Zealand, but also Australia, Mexico, and so on. Okay, so this is coming. How do we do? Should we just comply purely, or should we try and make the most out of it and use it as an innovation leverage, which is what I think is the right way to go, but actually not necessarily. But if you want to innovate, right? If you want to use this program to attract innovators into monetize these APIs, this is what you should be doing. So first, before we talk about the API lifecycle, let's talk about some of the key common grounds here. So we've run a research last year with over 130 banks, so asking them questions about open banking, right? So just to have an idea of how an open banking program would look like. So most of them think they will have to manage from 1 to 10 APIs. So, and I think that gives you sort of guidelines, right, for your programs or for the APIs you will be managing. So it's about 1 to 10 APIs that you will be having. Managing or measuring performance really is going to be about revenue, number of API calls, so we'll get back to that in a moment. But what's interesting here is the, here. So what's interesting is the technology. There is a consensus around technology, some technology you can use. I don't know if you can see, I can see, but 71% says that they are using RESTful interfaces. So we'll get back to what REST is, but so REST is definitely the standard for APIs today. A use of an API management solution and an open standard, and we talked about standards before as well. So these are the kind of three components that came back the most, and I think this is really, if you're using these things, you're kind of right. We asked them about their key challenges that they find when implementing an open banking program. Well, by far the most important 3 years, we've run this study for 3 years. 3 years in a row, the most important challenge is culture, right? So corporate culture, getting support internally and so on. And so for me, I go back to my misconception of open banking is not technical. For you to have a successful API program, it's really about engaging beyond technology, beyond just one silo, right? So how do we change the culture internally as well to move into this openness and collaboration? That's what we should be doing as well. Yeah, and then security obviously is very important concern for these guys, compliance, budget, technology, and so on. But by far, like culture, the lack of understanding and support internally, that's really what's happening. So, and again, so here I guess the takeaway is that we should be building APIs, but we should also be communicating about what we're doing and communicating the value internally in parallel. Okay, let's go to the life cycle of the APIs, and this is very kind of high level overview. usually when we do this workshop, we take a bit more time, and it usually takes us 2 days to do this. But so very kind of high level overview. How do you build an API? Well, first thing is it should be about having a business use case for this, right? Like, what is it that we want to build? Why we want to build it, right? Okay, it's one thing. Then you design it, and let's say it's like about payment. It's we want to introduce a new payment method, right? Okay, cool. Then you design your payment API, right? So this is writing the specification for these APIs. Then you actually build it. So there's working code. It's connected to your system, so it does the functionality it's meant to do. You make sure it's secure, and there's no data breach and so on. That's possible. And then you publish it and you operate it and support it. You get people to use it, right? You get third parties to use it. Again, we're in a frame where we want to use an open banking program not just purely to comply, but really to go about and get these people to use our APIs and to enrich our services, right? So I think that's the kind of life cycle. And what I'll do now is we'll look into each part of this life cycle and see what are the key learnings and key takeaways. So when it comes to the use case, I think open banking shouldn't be Google Glass, basically. It shouldn't be like a technical solution, super developed, super attractive, but then there's no use for it. There's no real use for it. So I think it should be the other way around. It should be like having conversation with the business stakeholders, finding a real use case for this, and then building the APIs for that. And you could do tons of things with APIs, right? So there's no shortage of things you can do, but I think it's really engaging that discussion. So you can do, like, APIs helps with, I don't know, card management, PFM solution so account aggregation is a kind of nice use case, which comes back a lot, right? Like having a chatbot. I want to build a chatbot. API is a good way to do that. So anyway, there are different use cases, but it's about finding the right one which works for the bank, which maybe is unique for you, and then understanding how using APIs can accelerate that, right? Like accelerate the development of this. So that's the first step. The second step is really the API design. I think that's where things get interesting. So as I was saying, the overall standard here is to use REST for these APIs. However, that's in theory, right? In practice, what we see is it's kind of a roast. It's a bit of REST. And so, by the way, I'm assuming most of the people in the room are sort of technical, have an understanding of the technology behind. If not, shout at me and I kind of give a bit more background. But so like really what we see effectively is a kind of a roast thing, right? It's a mix of it's a bad REST basically. It's like soapy stuff, but kind of in the get and posing kind of a REST style. That's not what you should be doing. What you should be doing, I believe, is proper REST. Following the rules of REST. REST is it's kind of an architecture style, so it's not really prescriptive that much, but it's kind of a way of doing things. But still, there are rules and there are ways to do it better than others. So I think the more you stick to those guidelines, the better you are. Why the more you stick to these guidelines is better is because that's what developers are expecting, right? So developers are used to a certain style of REST APIs. If you give them something different, well, that would impact their productivity, which means it will impact the success of your program. So what makes a good API? A good API is REST, and this is very kind of topical, and a good API is REST today in 2018. It might be something different in the future, right? But it's really, what I'm telling you is, it's not a general truth, it's really what we're contextually today. So REST is definitely what developers expect. JSON as well, so we've seen XML and so on, but JSON by far is like the thing that most of the developers are going to be expecting. Good documentation and support, we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Good error messages, so very important and again, here to use the HTTP error messages. So there are standards in place. Do not reinvent the wheel. Use what exists already. That's a lot more useful. Consistent developer experience, really important as well, and that goes back to the roast kind of thing. So really, as much as you can, try to have a consistent developer experience, a consistent way of offering things. So, you know, if there is a balance, like, you know, it shouldn't be a type of balance here, a type of balance there, and a type of balance, you know, somewhere else. Every time it should be like 3 balances if you have 3 different balances, right? So really make sure I think the guiding principle here is, and I said that yesterday and I will say it again later, treat your API as a product. This product is consumed by customer target, which is the developers. So build everything you're building with the developer in mind, right? With this end user, this customer in mind, and give them something consistent. What's also really important here is that whatever you design is actually testable. It's great to have lots of your architect teams sitting together, doing lots of workshops and talking and stuff, and then coming up with a report of like 100 pages with beautiful UML diagrams. But that doesn't cut it from a developer perspective. What developers want is a sandbox or a testable environment where they can very quickly try these APIs your teams just designed. So very quickly they can try, they give you feedback, you can improve. So it's kind of an agile process. So I think we talked about JSON. So this is an example of what a JSON file looks like. And yeah, as I said, REST is an architecture pattern. And what's important here with this idea of having a consistent developer experience is because REST is done across the board in one way, so developers can assume you're going. So I'll give you an example. If your URL is, I don't know, bank/accounts, then they know if they do account/ the account ID, they will get access to this account. So it helps their productivity to make assumptions and to have a consistent developer experience. Another thing which is really important when it comes to designing APIs. So again, there's a part which is the actual design. We said like JSON, REST, and so on. Usually the API, the outcome of this is a Swagger file. Swagger is a type of a file type which describes APIs, right? There are different ways to describe APIs. You can use RAML, Blueprint, and so on. But Swagger is like this sort of becoming the industry standard in a way. So that's what you should expect, like a Swagger file in the end. But more than just the file, as I was saying, you need a testable environment, some sort of sandbox. You need really good documentation if you want developers to use it. Again, these are not your staff, right? They're not paid to use your APIs, so they're doing it because they have other motivations. So you need to give them really good documentation. If you're looking for a good example of API documentation, of course, Open Bank project is one. But you can also look at Stripe. Stripe has a really good API documentation. Not only they have good API documentation, they also have what we call SDKs, right? And code samples. So SDK is software development kit. It's so APIs, RESTful APIs are language agnostic. You can use them in Java, in Python, in whatever language you use. An SDK, but it's kind of slightly complicated to get there, or it takes time to get, to use them in these different languages. So to speed up the process, we do have SDKs, so software development kits, for a particular API in a particular language. So it wraps these RESTful calls into a Python code or Java code or Ruby code, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're a Python developer, you would want to use the open banking SDKs in Python because it helps you be more productive. And so having these SDKs is really important to drive productivity of the third-party developers. And again, here in Stripe, I think they claim you can do payment. You can make payment in like, I don't know, 30 seconds or something like that. This is because they already have code samples, so you can just copy paste. I think they even have a button for you to copy, so you don't even need to do Control C. So really thought through, and so you just copy the code, put it into your code, and boom, you made a payment. It's a really nice experience, and I think that's what works when it comes to API design, right? So good design, and then way for developers to interact with it and to give you feedback. So that's for the design bit. Do you have any questions on this stage? Is that clear? Yeah.
Hi, quick question. So are these recommendations coming from your experience or from the open banking standard?
It's coming from our experience. If you're talking about the UK open banking standard, I don't think they issued recommendations. I mean, they issued a design. So that's what they have. Their design is a Swagger file, as I was saying, and they have a sandbox as well. So but these are really our, our opinion or our learnings, let's say.
See, it's interesting here. Security is at the end of the process. So you're not really designing security into the solution. Security is provided after.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the answer is no. And as I was saying earlier, I think it's really like a high-level kind of schematic view of how you build an API. And I'll talk a bit more about it at the security level. But the idea here is not to say it's an afterthought. No, not at all. Other questions? All right, cool. So let's talk about the build now, right? So actually, now that you have the design, the specification, how are you going to build and create these APIs, right? So there are three ways to build. There are three ways to build open banking APIs, right? You can do it yourself. You can build the whole program yourself using maybe an API management solution. There's a few of them already. You can partner with the solution provider, which provide this platform already, Open Bank projects and I guess others. Or you can partner with, you can outsource the program in a way. You can partner with an API hub, what I call an API hub, which will integrate with different banks and offer the designer, the developer, one-stop shop, one API interface they connect to, and from that one-stop shop, they can get data from the different banks. Whether you choose one or another really depends. I think there are pros and cons to each one. So if you build the program in-house, obviously you have a lot more control. You decide pretty much everything, but it might take you lots of money, it might take you lots of time, and it might be risky, it might not really work. If you use something from the market, off the shelf, then you have maybe less control, but you know that it works, and you have basically you know what you're getting, right? Like you have a discrete solution, you know what the APIs are, which APIs are there. You can plan, you have a roadmap, you know what next APIs are going to come up, and so on and so forth. Open Bank project takes kind of a unique and interesting approach here, where everything we write is open source, right? So, and I think this is really interesting to consider, at least, because having an open source solution means you have access to the code. There's no vendor lock-in. If you need to change at some point down the line, you need to change something in the platform itself, you will be able to do that because you have access to the code. So I think definitely open source is something important here to consider. Now the third option, which is this kind of outsourcing, and usually happens through, today, we see that through screen scrapers. So not sure if you're familiar with something called Yodlee in the US, which kind of screen scrape tons of banks. Obviously not secure, but you can think of a similar model, but in the future, but instead of screen scraping, it will be API access to all the banks. Now the benefit of that model is that from a bank perspective, it's really the least amount of effort, right? So you don't have to do much. Like, you already have your internal API, you give them access to this hub, and that's pretty much it. So it's nice from perspective of time to market and budget. However, it's not really nice in terms of control. So you don't decide which APIs you're going to offer. It's the third party which decides, the APIs and the roadmap for these APIs. You don't decide who's using your APIs. It's the third party deciding who are the partners. And in some cases, you don't even have a view on who is using these APIs, right? Like you don't see the usage, you don't see the inside the metrics, you can't monitor the usage of your APIs, of your data. And for us, this is really terrible because you want to have the metrics, you want to have the data on the usage. That's really what makes a successful API program, right? I will talk about metrics at some point as well. So these are the three aspects. But if you want to comply, probably this is what you can do to kind of do it quickly.
The hub, though, could provide all that data, right? API usage to us.
It could be, yeah, that's what I'm saying. In some cases, so if you take, there are some solution providers in the UK, it's like the real solution today, which do not give you back this information. But it could be, of course, it could be, it could also be a hub of different banks, right? There is value in that model. Like I'm not, saying there is no value in it, right? It could be, a group of banks which do not compete, right? And they put one platform, and it's really like a group of smaller banks, for instance, right? Credit unions or something like that. They have the same platform, so they rationalize the cost, but it's good for developers because the fintechs, so instead of going to one bank and it has, 100,000 customers, I can go to this platform and I know I have access to, 500,000 or 1 million customers. So no, there's definitely benefit in this, but you need to be you need to be aware of what you're losing, how much it costs you, and versus what what you're giving. So that's for the build phase. Now, if you talk to security, of course, I don't want to. Again, security is not an afterthought here. What I really want to talk about in this step, particularly, is authentication. It's something which happens differently in an open banking program. I think all of your security models are still relevant, and we're not going to change any of that. But if there's one thing which changes, is authentication, right? Authentication, because we're working with third parties and so on, happens through or needs to happen with. We need to keep the security of the end users, and we need to keep the end users. We need to how do you say? We need to prevent these as much as we can. Prevent these third parties from breaching the system of the banks. Obviously, the way we do authentication in an open banking world, again, as a kind of a general consensus, is through something called OAuth, or through delegation of authentication, I should say. So delegation of authentication is a method, is a way to authenticate someone, access an authenticated resource, but without disclosing password and login of the end user. I'll say that again. So it's really a way for me as a bank customers to access third-party services without giving those third-party services my login and password. And this is really important if we want to make that work, right? Like the third parties, the PFM, the budgeting apps will have access to my transactions, but not to my login and password. How do we do it effectively? Today, there's an industry standard. It's called, so we typically use OAuth or OpenID Connect. The UK Open Banking Standard recommend OpenID Connect. I think there is, like more people are moving towards OpenID Connect. And the general idea of this sort of delegation of authentication is that to access an authenticated or to access a secured resource, what I'll do is I'll request access. So basically, I will take the way it works. Let's say, again, we have this budgeting app. I open the budgeting app on my phone. It says connect to my bank. I click connect to my bank. It will take me to the login page of my online banking. So I'm logged in on the bank systems. I'm no longer on the app. I put my login and password normally, and it's secured and so on. That authenticates me against my bank. So my bank says, okay, Ismail Chaib is here. We have this. We know this user. The bank sends back a token to the app. So we go back to the app with a token. And that token enables the third-party app to access the data I requested, whether that's the list of transactions or making a payment and so on and so forth. So that's how the model works, right? That token has sort of 3 legs, right? So the token is valid for a particular app, is valid for a particular user at the bank, and is valid for a certain duration of time. So you can say, sorry, it's just one-off. You could say it's 48 hours, it's indefinite, so on and so forth. And these are all things which needs to be considered, of course. But that's the sort of general way of doing this sort of authentication. And again, this is really what's been happening across the industry. Very important here is that you will have, so again, we go back to this idea of disintermediation. Every time the bank, the user, your customers will log in, will request access, they will have to go to your site. They will have to log in on your normal login session. So they're exposed to your brand, and they have to log in, and then that redirects them back to the app, right? So you're not disintermediated. You're actually in front of any transactions, any meaningful interaction with the client. And you're the brand that ensures that this is secure, that this is trustworthy. So you're not disintermediated. Okay. The other thing is the scope of, so the other parameter for security for when you authenticate, you can control the scope of things that you open, right? It could be, just giving them access to payment or, just giving them access to read data only, so reading transactions. For others, they will have access to payment initiation, et cetera, et cetera. So you control that as well. Okay, let's talk about the kind of last bit of the life cycle. So it's really the operating. Okay, now that you have an APIs and it's secure and so on, and so you put it, you publish it, it's out there, you have a developer portal. Then what? No one used it. There's no one using your APIs, so it's a bit of a problem, right? And I think what should not be an afterthought as well is really this step. So this is really what's crucial. This is what changes. This is what's new and different here, right? Like we have been producing API and so on, and securing APIs, and building APIs, designing APIs. We haven't been providing our APIs to third parties outside the bank walled garden. So I think that's, if you have to spend lots of time, I think that's where you need to be spending lots of time. And this is how can we get our APIs to be consumed and to be used? And again, here I think there is a process, right? So if you think about it from a developer perspective, so developer needs to first to find you, right? To find the developer portal that you put in place. In a kind of an attention economy where, like, how do you get their attention to get there? They need to register, okay? You're asking them something, they need to register to get an API key. They need to see your APIs, understand which one works for them, discover what you're offering, and then they need to start using them, right? And when they start using them, they might have questions, so you need to support them, right? Like, okay, how do you support these guys, right? Like, what are ways they can ask you questions? And once they are done, they have an application. How do what do we do with these applications? Is it going straight to our customers? How do you feature it? How do you help get it into the hand of the customers? How do you help secure these applications? And so on and so forth. It's really critical questions, and the challenge here is that they are new questions for us as a banking industry. And again, going back to really good example of that is Slack, right? So banks have been, accepting payment through cards and so on, but then Slack comes and becomes over $1 billion in valuation, and just offering an API to accept credit card payment. Very simple process which has been done by banks for years, but they put a really nice API on top. They put an amazing developer experience on top of that, and they got many developers to use them. So again, if you're looking for an example of a nice developer experience, I think Stripe is a good example. But in here, I think what you should be doing is when thinking about this developer experience, I think you have to have this developer portal. It needs to be developer friendly, so SDKs are a must, code samples are a must. An important metric here is how much time does it take for a developer to use my APIs, right? So I think that's a metric which is really key there is also a number of techniques called growth hacking. So basically, how can we market to developers and to get them to know about our programs? So I think there's a lot you can do there, from social media marketing to evangelization. We have this new role of an API evangelist. So someone whose sole role is to advocate for developers internally at the bank and to reach out to developers to tell them about the bank open banking programs. I think we'll see more of these API evangelists coming up, and someone that developers can refer to and goes back to. So really different things. And support. Support is really critical as well here, right? So if you have an API and it doesn't work and doesn't have like kind of a nice performance and no one to support, if people have questions, then you're in trouble. So make sure you think about support here as well. And the last bit you might need to do, kind of a new role, is this business development aspect. So now that you have apps and services built by third parties, how do you get them to, how do you pick the ones that works for you, and how do you get them in the hand of your customers? And I think here there is this idea of the model that we suggest is always have a sandbox environment, a test environment where developers can try, do whatever they want. It's all just test data, kind of outside the bank test data. So they can do whatever they want, and then when they are ready, when they are mature, they go into the certification process, right? And the certification it covers like functional reviews. Does the app do what it says it do? Data and security testing, of course, and then validation. And the validation is basically the bank saying, again, assuming there is no regulatory framework telling you to do otherwise, basically it's the bank saying, offering terms and conditions. So does the app comply with the terms and conditions I'm offering? Maybe the bank is competing with an app, the app is competing with an app you have already. It doesn't make sense for you to have them there. And then you also will think about how do you distribute this app? Do we have a marketplace? Do we have an app store where we distribute the apps that we like? Do we have tiers of partnership? Do we have sandbox open for everyone, and then we have a tier of like people who have access to some of our APIs, and then we have a kind of a premium app program where we select a certain number of partners that are privileged partners, and we give them more APIs, we give them more access, we give them better SLA, so on and so forth, right? So, and I think that's what's going to happen is you will be managing this ecosystem of developers, and you will be segmenting this ecosystem of developers. You have the kind of the long tail of developers where they have access to sandbox, they can do whatever they want. Maybe at some point someone would come with something innovative that makes sense to you. You'll have a number of partners that you have to give access to because of regulation or something else. And then you have a tiny group, a niche of privileged partners where you want to do, which is really critical for you, that they succeed. So you do more for these guys, right? You feature them on your app store, or some do co-marketing events and so on. Does that make sense so far? All right, cool. Any questions? Yeah.
Just got a quick question. So, because it is, sorry.
Sure.
Because it is an ecosystem and it's not sort of a hub and spoke model, how would the certification process work where there are multiple layers? So, for example, a bank might connect in with Xero connects in with 600 other apps. Those apps probably have APIs of their own and they connect in with other apps. So how do you ensure that auditing is done at every single layer?
How do you ensure, so maybe I rephrase the questions. So basically what you're saying is, as a bank, I'm going to give away, to offer data to third parties, but the third parties are going to, so other third parties are going to use that data. How do we ensure where the problem lies, if any problems? Is that correct?
Yeah. Well,
So,
like,
So I think there are two things here, right? So there is a kind of a technical answer to this, and so you can control it at the terms and condition, right? So in this validation phase, that's what I'm the certification process, right? So where you actually, it's like certifying an app on an app store, right? So you're actually looking at what does the app, what's the app is doing, what the app is doing, right? So you, before granting, and again, Open API is not public API. So before granting an API key to these guys, before they are able to access any service, you have done, supposedly you've done your review and you've figured out that what they're only doing what they say they are doing. They're not doing something shady on the side. So that's one thing. Terms and condition as well. Terms and condition, it's part of the whole developer experience. So what do you let these developers do? And again, here, there's a regulatory framework which might force you to do otherwise, but if not, you know, like what's the scope? Like maybe you can say you can't share data with third parties and so on. So that's another thing. And then ultimately, it's really the customer. Like this is about giving control back to the customer, right? This is about data sovereignty. So it's the customer saying yes or no to giving access to this third party, right? So it's always done with the consent of the customers. If it's something shady and, you know, like kind of done in the background, then it should be surfaced at the certification step. Does that address the question?
Can I take another one? In the previous slide, it said something like share liability.
Mm-hmm.
So would that apply in cases like this one where something hasn't been inspected and all the parties are actually like
My view on this is where regulation is important, right? The PSD2 regulation talks about shared liability, and what they mean is whoever does the breach, so there is an audit, and whoever does the breach, where the breach comes from, that's the liable party. So that could be the third party, that could be the bank. This is not a general rule, this is not how it should be done or anything. This is what the regulator said, and that's it. Like we just need to comply to this. So I think we don't have answers to the liability question. I think that's where industry, groups and regulators and these sort of working groups will shed lights and give different answers depending on the context. Yeah.
So if you go through the compliance phase, if you like, how do you ensure that you keep that at still in compliance going forward? I mean, if you look at it there, we've got what happens if we don't look at it for a bit and suddenly that's looking out of compliance. Are you saying we need a big monitoring thing to keep monitoring the acts going forward, some sort of programs to keep monitoring them?
Yeah, so monitoring is essential, and we'll see that in a minute. So you will be monitoring the usage of the APIs, and you will be sort of spotting misbehaving APIs. But then the other question is, and I think it's a question, it would depend, it's really case by case, depending on the banks. So how do you do when the app has a new version? How do you certify that, right? And sometimes these app developers, they have a version every month, if not every week. And I think that's what, again, maybe regulation will shed lights and give guidelines here, but that's what's that will depend on each bank. Actually, if you take the PSD2 example again, they don't force you to review each version, right? Like you just have to have a valid certificate. And with that, you can access any time. And then if something happens, if something bad happens, and you're monitoring that, as we said, then we see who's liable for it or not.
So, just a question
Sure.
on that again. If they break the terms and conditions, where are we going with that? Are we going to take them to court? Is that sort of thing? Or is there some regulatory rule that we can go to?
Again, depends on the current regulatory framework. Depends where you are. As I understand here, is it's a normal. The terms and condition. It's a contract, right? So they're in breach of a contract. you do what needs to be done. In Europe, there is a central authority managing this access. So if there is a breach, there is a central authority actually per country, per member country that you need to go to. Similar in the UK, there is a body doing that. Okay, I think I need to kind of speed up things maybe, or maybe not. Okay, so another key aspect of this, so maybe just going back to what I was saying before, this idea of providing a superior, really nice developer experience is key should you want your APIs to be used. If you don't want your APIs to be used, and that's a valid point, like maybe you don't want this third party to manage all these third parties and stuff, give them really crappy user experience. No one will use it. And that's a valid point, really. So now, how do you measure success, right? And on that note as well, terms and conditions, again, really important. Make sure you have developer-friendly, fintech-friendly terms and conditions. There's a bank we're working with. They've reviewed their POC processes. So now they give access to sandbox for all the startups they want to do POCs with. But also they reviewed their procurement process. So they have simpler terms and conditions, which are more like startup friendly. So I think this is also something new. Your vendor onboarding processes, this doesn't work. If it takes us 3 months to get onto your vendor list, it doesn't really work. So you need to do work on that side as well. How do we make the procurement faster in the terms and conditions more like friendlier to the fintech? One thing most banks usually go into is the IP question, right? So banks wants to keep the IP. Actually, the IP is not yours if it's built by a third party. So I think these questions of like IP in friendlier terms needs to be addressed as well. Okay, so measuring success. So how do you measure success? So I think, as we just said, monitoring is key here. And I see 2 sets of KPIs for an API program, kind of a service KPIs, things around availability, performance, error rate. This API, number of API calls as well. This might even be regulated. So if you take the example of the UK, there are specific SLAs, or the EU as well, specific SLAs that the banks needs to comply with. In the UK, there's even a dashboard, kind of a public dashboard, where all the banks needs to feed in data and measurements about their API program. So whenever an API is down, you actually flag it on that dashboard. So another one, as I was saying, the time to first API call, really important to track that if you want. If developers can easily get to your first API call, that's great. That means you're doing things right. On the other side, we have business KPIs, of course, revenue, if any. I don't think there is a business model for APIs as of yet. It's really case by case. It depends on the bank, depends on the actual asset you're opening up through APIs. The number of partners, maybe by type. So as I said, you'll have privileged partners, you'll have kind of others that could be interesting at some point, and then you have an army of like a long tail of other partners which you just need to give them some form of access, not all of it. Who are active, who are not, the top, so something like measuring the top apps, so what are the most used applications, right? That's really insightful to you as a bank because it can help you in the API roadmap, in the in the general product roadmaps, like what my customers are really interested in, right? That's a really nice answer to get from there. And then also, if you pick some of these top apps, you can help promote them to other customers, right? So it's a nice way it's a nice virtuous cycle. You can feature some of these apps to more customers, and they will like them. Again, what's the top APIs? What are your developers are using the most? Again, it will help inform the next phase of APIs you deploy. And these are fairly standard APIs. If you use an API management solution, you will have most of these things already in place, so you can configure them quite quickly. So that's for successful API programs. Do we have any questions at that stage?
You touched on the issue of consent. What about consent and entitlement? Do you see that as being managed in a standard way across banks, or is it too specific to an individual bank to have a common function?
So I think there is a standard emerging for the technology to be used, right? And I talked about OpenID Connect. The idea of delegation of authentication, I think, is very strong and happening across the board. Now, how does each bank or each jurisdiction do it specifically? I think that's going to. So, for instance, how much time does the token last? Right? Is it indefinite consent? Is it per transactions? Is it 3 days?
I think more in terms of the consent of a customer to give consent to a third party to access their data, and the entitlement of a third party to be able to access an API, as opposed to the timed.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is, in general, the technology to do that and the frame of doing that, I think it's pretty, there's a good consensus around that. And it is this sort of OAuth type approach, right, of this redirection and so on. That's what's happening across. I'm not seeing, some banks doing something else. The specificity is the configuration for each one. I think that's different. But yeah, as a model, definitely delegation of authentication. Other questions?
Thank you for sharing your experience. It's very fascinating. Do you think, you mentioned before that you referenced business partners and entrepreneurs as the users, I guess. But do you envisage a future where individual customers become their own entrepreneurs and develop their own software to manage their finances? And what challenges does that have?
No, absolutely. Actually, it's already happening. If you take Monzo, which is a challenger bank from the UK, they have an API program which is only available to customers of Monzo. So if you're a customer of Monzo, you're like sort of tech savvy, you can use an API where you can build any app you want and use their API. So it's not shared with third parties. So that's a valid model, right? What are the challenges that brings? I think it's important for banks to segment, as I was saying, like what's the type of partners that I might have, and what do I get and give to each one of them? This is probably part of the long tail of customers of these APIs, right? So it's individuals. Maybe someone will come up with something interesting at some point that can be shared with others. Maybe you can tap into that sort of ethos and say, look, this is who we are, and we want to enable our customers to. Our customers are tech savvy. We want to enable them to build apps and to share their apps between themselves, right? To create a nice forum, nice community feel over that. So that's possible. You can make something nice about that. But I think it's really about segmenting and understanding which target audience am I talking to, and what do they need from me? What can I get from it? So the way you would interact with a partner such as Amazon. So we can think of an application like, I do the Amazon checkout process. In the end, instead of pay by credit card, it says pay in installment and provided by my bank, right? It's possible. But the way you would interact with an Amazon is definitely, it's different from the way you interact with a solo entrepreneur, right? Like with my own bank account. And I think your open banking program should sort of understand and translate that into reality, that differences into reality. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned before about making developer-friendly APIs and making their lives easier. And I know some banks still catching up with customer experience, so developer experience is quite important. So I'm wondering what some banks are doing to get their heads around promoting development.
It's a good question. I think I showed in how you build your APIs, like partnering with someone who's done it before is probably the way to go. Actually, if you take the example of banks who've built APIs in-house, the vast majority, the API experience is really bad. So, and you know, it's normal. So I think it needs to, like, I don't know. I think it needs. It's about talent, maybe. I think if you really still want to build it internally in-house, you probably need to hire talents who've done that before, who comes from more of this fintech or this startup mindset than coming from the bank. And we see that as well. So maybe a good example is BBVA. BBVA, large company, a huge bank from Spain. What they did to run their API program, they built it in-house completely, like even the API management layer. What they did is they bought a startup which was doing, like a fintech startup, which was doing some kind of a digital challenger bank kind of thing. And they integrated that startup, and the startup become, like the team from the startup become their API team. And they were able to produce something good because they had the talent they integrated through this acquisition. So that's maybe, you know, one way to do that. But again, you can partner with others. Cool. So let's talk about Open Bank Project then. So Open Bank Project is a leading open source API solution for banks. We help banks expose APIs. We help them work with fintech startups. We basically built these 3 pillars. Just one second. We built these 3 pillars. The first one is, I can go back to this one. So the first thing we built is a technology platform, right? It's a middleware which sits on premise behind the bank firewall. It connects to the legacy of the bank, abstract away the complexity of that legacy. That could be COBOL stuff, that could be, you know, like old style or ESB, internal APIs, and open up these legacy systems, data, and services to the outside world. So it opens up to the outside world through a set of, as we were discussing, RESTful, developer-friendly APIs, and it adds the security requirement that needs to be done and so on. Now, this platform comes with, so this is more of a technical thing. So again, it's a RESTful banking APIs. It's all really strictly RESTful. It's built in Scala. And it uses a message queue, Kafka message queue, to connect to the bank legacy, and it's on GitHub. So you can actually download it, you can use it, you can use it on your laptop, try it for free. It's all, you know, there to be used. And it uses flexible, it comes with an OAuth. We have an OAuth 1, OAuth 2 servers that you can use, and you use flexible connectors. So we basically can connect to anything. We have pre-built connectors for like things like Temenos or Oracle FlexCube, but we can also connect to different systems or homegrown systems as well through these connectors. So that API layer gives you also a catalog of pre-built APIs. So we've pre-designed 160 APIs so that you do not have to design them yourself and go through this, you know, making nice REST and not ROST APIs and so on and so forth. So we have 160 that covers access to account, transactions, payment initiation, but it goes way beyond that. We also have KYC APIs, we also have card management APIs, data analytics APIs, etc., etc. And the point here is that most of the legislation talks about pure access to account and payment, but actually there is a lot more. You can do a lot more with APIs. Any asset that you have, or most of the assets that you have at the bank, could be opened up through APIs, and there is an opportunity to do so. So that helps you accelerate this design phase, right? So you don't have to do it.
Ismail?
Yes?
How did you develop your 160?
See, there you go. That's what I was going to say next. So how did we design these APIs? So really started from, I guess it's a virtuous cycle. It always starts with a requirement from one of our bank partners, bank customers. So the bank comes to us and say, hey, I want a transaction API, or I want a loan API, or something like that. We work with their teams to specify, to have a kind of a simple specification for these APIs. What we do next is we write code for these specifications. So we don't stop at just writing the specification. We make that specification usable, testable, right, through sandbox and so on. So we push it into a sandbox and we ask developers to come and test it, to come and use it, give us feedback. We take their feedback to improve the design of the API. So it's a really agile process, very pragmatic. We do not want this waterfall. It's like we go from an idea and we have a nice design. No, we take the design, we make it usable, and we see what people say after that. And this has been running for 5 years, so you can only imagine how much feedback we gathered and to kind of improve these APIs. And the guiding principle here is fintech friendliness, right? So the developer is the target audience. Like, how can we make it easy for them? They may be in their garage. They haven't been working for a bank before. How can we make it easy for them to develop, to use them quickly, to make them productive? So does that address the question?
It does. Just one more question.
Sure.
Your catalogue over the last 5 years presumably has come out of Europe. As European banks, European...
Not necessarily. So as I was saying, like, we work with 40 bank customers in the US, Europe, Australia, Middle East. So I think we got requirements from everywhere. Of course, it started in Europe, and it started with the core stuff like access to payment, transactions, and so on. But all the stuff around, so the KYC, the card management, the data analytics, that came from all these partners, all these customers.
Okay, so across multiple regions.
Yeah, and the idea is to have something which is like interoperable cross regions. We don't do things which are specific. You can how do you say, make it custom to your particular country at some point, but what we have is really something that can be used across countries, and it's been used across countries actually. Yeah.
How far away from the ASA models have you gone with bringing developer-friendly APIs?
I'm sorry, I didn't listen.
How far have you gone away from the ASA standards, ASA 222 standard, to create developer-friendly APIs?
So the question was, how far are we close or far from the ISO standard? So another guiding principle for designing APIs is being pragmatic. And what being pragmatic means for us is that we would use any standard when it makes sense. So we use standards like for, I don't know, let's say dates, for example, right? So we would use ISO when it makes sense, but we won't use it when it's too, so basically the developer friendliness trump the ISO standardization. And anytime we have to make that decision, we'll go for the developer friendliness. So it doesn't look like ISO. It has parts of it sometimes, but it doesn't look like.
Even going as far as breaking the terminology?
Sometimes we do. Sometimes yes. Again, very pragmatic. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's ISO compliant.
So do
Yeah.
you version
Yeah.
APIs or iterate?
Yeah, it's versioned, yeah. And the version is in the URL, so you can identify the version quite easily, and you can have multiple versions on the same instance, so you can support versions backwards and so on. Yeah. Sorry, I just have a question from here. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier on in your definition on open banking that it should be something that drives customer-centric innovation. And then you later back that up by saying an API should not be a technical solution looking for a problem. That diagram starts with, on the right, asking a bank about what they think their customers want, which possibly isn't a good place to start. Can you talk about other banks that you've worked with that do this really well as far as capturing those customers? Because the developers are those new customers, of course.
Yeah.
But who does this really well? Because there's an implicit danger in this process that you build something, build a suite of APIs that don't get consumed and don't get used.
No, that's very true. Although, so let's say there's two types of APIs. And I think I'm talking about this maybe next. Yeah. There are really two types of APIs that you can open, right? There is a core set of APIs which we know most developers want, which are the access to account, transactions, payment initiation. This is the so I call them core APIs, right? That's what you would think of directly. In fact, to back this claim with data, Open Bank project, we receive about 145,000 API calls every day on our main sandbox. And out of these API calls, the top 3 are access to account, bank transactions, and payments, right? That's what developers tell us they want. So there is this core, and then there's another type of APIs, which is very specific to the bank, right? So, and where I think having a business, like a use case and having it driven by a business makes sense. So these are like something like, you already have a loan origination process, and like a way for people to get a loan for a car, for instance. But you want to make that as an API so that you can give it to different car dealership, right? That's a kind of particular program which might be run at a certain bank. Having APIs accelerate the adoption of that program, accelerate the scaling to different car dealership, to many car dealerships, right? So I think that's at least how we think about it. There's these 2 types. There's the core set of APIs most of developers would expect, which is the access to transaction, account, and payments, and so on. And then there are some unique particular APIs which really needs to be driven by the business inside the bank. Does that make sense? Does that address the question? Yeah.
Yes, mine was back on the topic of versioning.
Yeah.
So I guess you mentioned you could version on the URL.
Mm-hmm.
You could also version at the message layer so that you could have a stable URL. Have you experienced any issues with versioning on the URL in terms of proliferation of endpoints?
I think so far we haven't. I think what you need to, so what's the problem, I guess, with versioning URLs is like you need to have a very clear way to support the old versions. And so I think as long as you have that and it's clear and it's transparent with the developers as well, I don't think there would be big problems. No, so I think you should version at the message level, but you should definitely version at the URL level, so that developers know what they are, what they expect, what's the services that this version has, right? Because then this is very agile. Like each version will have probably different APIs and so on, right? Bigger scope. Good. So let's move on. Where were we? Okay, so Open Bank project provides a software platform, a catalog of pre-built APIs, and sort of the third pillar, which is quite unique to this, is the community access to community. Today there are over 9,000 developers using our APIs to build financial technology applications. These are fintechs, startups, established companies, solo entrepreneurs who are keen to work with banks or keen to work with you to deploy new financial technology applications. They come from pretty much all over the world. And they have built things like e-invoicing applications, apps for SMEs, apps for kids. So here we go back to this idea of micro segments. So lots of things. They've built chatbots, PFM solution, etc., etc. And what the Open Bank project software layer provides them is everything they need to be productive, to succeed, and to go on, right? So that starts with the developer portal, branded for the bank, where they can register and get an API key. That's about documentation, as we were saying, and SDKs. That's also business logic, right? So, banking is not any other business, right? There's some regulatory, there's some complicated business rules to be implemented, and so that's what we add at the Open Bank project layer. Another thing we add, which I think is really interesting, is the notion of metadata. So we're able to enrich transactions with metadata, such as geolocation, tags, comments, pictures, etc., etc. So you can imagine going to a restaurant, business meeting, you take a picture of the receipt, you pay the the receipt, but the picture of the receipt goes automatically to your expense management software, but it also goes to the to your bank account, so it's attached to your transaction. So suddenly now the bank has more information on that transaction, not just the net, but the actual the actual receipt, right? So you have a lot more information about what your customers are doing. And what I encourage you to do, and I guess this is yet another misconception, open banking is not just about giving data to third parties. You can use that to get data from third parties as well, in the form of metadata and other things, and insights and stuff. But really think about it as, okay, we're giving this, but what can we get, right? So, and again, metadata is really something which I think is not looked with the importance it should have. We also do different access management, so at the API layer, so different access management and different access roles. So as an account holder, you can share access to your bank account with your accountant. You can give access to some of the data, all of the data. Maybe you can give access to third party just to the dates and the amount of the transaction, not the description, right? So, and the point here is that going back to authentication and so on, the sharing data with third parties doesn't have to be on-off, doesn't have to be I give you all my data or I give you none. It could also be granular, and the end user decides what data I share with which third party, right? So I think when you're designing your API programs, you should also think about this, like what's this kind of spread of data that we share. So that's what we also provide an API manager. So this is really the admin interface where you can kind of identify all the apps that are connected on your platform. You can revoke access at any point in time if someone is misbehaving. You can see monitorings and kind of monitor this instance with your KPIs and so on. You can skip this. Yeah, you can basically hear what I'm saying is like you can deploy it. There's a Docker image for it, so if you want to deploy it on your laptop or anywhere in the cloud, you can do it quite quickly. This is for a quick demo. I'll try and do that quickly. Actually, if you have your laptop, most of you don't, but you can actually go live and try it with me as we speak. It's on apisandbox.com. So what I want to do now in the next 5 minutes or so, very briefly, is show you how to make your first API call, right? Exciting. So basically, it's very simple. You just go to this URL, and that's your first API call. This calls the version, so it tells you. So this is the version 2.1. It tells you which version you're in, what instance of the OpenBank project, and which Git commit you have. So if you go type that into your browser, you'll see the version, and that's an API call. This is a REST API call, by the way, and that's pretty much it. Now, the most interesting API, this is an unauthenticated, this is kind of a public API call, right? It's unauthenticated, everyone can do it. It's not really interesting information. However, most of the interesting information, transactions and so on, that's going to be secured and authenticated. So we need to do something more to access the data. So as a developer, what you need to do is you need to register an OpenBank project. So put your name and so on. You need to register an app. Right, so then what's the app doing and so on, and after that you have an API key, right? So you have a consumer key that you can use, sort of token that you can use to access the authenticated or the secure, the protected resources, right? And with that API key, we can track you. We know that app X has accessed the account and so on and so forth. So when we do audit, we know exactly who did what. This is another tool that we provide. It's called API Explorer. So it's also online. You can check it out, apiexplorer.openbankproject.com. And basically what it does is it lists all the APIs on this instance, and you can interact with them just by clicking. So you can go to apiexplorer.com. First thing you need to do is you need to log in. Here we have some test customers. There are 2 ways to log in, OAuth 1 and 2, and we have direct login as well. If I have questions, I can get back to that, but otherwise I'll skip it. But direct login is important. So what you do is, so you're on Open Bank project, you log in, and then you can choose the bank, you can choose the account, you can choose the view. The view is, it's specific to Open Bank project. It's who has access to, it's this access right, basically. So I take an owner view, so I have access to everything. And boom, you have 160 APIs that you can choose from and you can test, right? So I click on get accounts at all bank, and I have the result. So that's a JSON format, right? With the bank ID, the link to it, etc., etc. I can do get transactions for one particular account. Again, here we can see the REST URL with accounts, account ID / transactions. And I have the list of transactions. Yeah, and then, so these are just examples, but you can use API Explorer to access the data, but you can use the different SDKs that we offer. You can use a REST client to access these APIs. And of course, there are not just access to transactions. You can try the 160 APIs. So, yeah, so I guess it would be interesting for the most technical of you if you go after the session to API Explorer and try some of these. And if you have any questions, you can let me know. So this is us. As I said, we work in 40 countries from US, Australia, Europe, Middle East. Typically tier 1 banks, so the likes of BNP Paribas, Société Générale, Santander, so typically large banks. And the process we take with these guys, and I showed this yesterday, and I don't think it's particularly unique to Open Bank project, is that there's this 3-step process to go into Open Banking. First step is to do experimentation. This is around sandboxes and providing test data to third parties and kind of building momentum for the program. The second is to do partner-only APIs, so connecting to live data, maybe core set of APIs, and identifying the partners beforehand. And then in a scale-up phase, you connect more APIs, again, 160 you can choose from and more, and you open it to more third-party partners. But again, with this idea that you certify the third-party partners, you have control. You decide which APIs you can open up, you decide which third party you want to work with, and you can revoke access at any point in time if someone is misbehaving. Case studies. Any questions about Open Bank project so far? All right, cool. So case studies. BNP Paribas is an interesting one. This is more on the sandbox kind of case study on the step 1 of this. Oops. So more on the experiment phase. So BNP Paribas, obviously a large global bank. We've been working with them for the last 3 years, and basically we've deployed a sandbox for them. Again, a sandbox is the full Open Bank project software hosted in the cloud, branded for the client, but not connected to the bank IT, right? So there's no connectivity to the legacy. It only uses test data, just pure fake test data. Yet with that, the bank has been able to do a series of hackathons. So we've done 10 hackathons last year with them, and in 10 different cities, and they've been able to approach and reach out to fintech startups. I think last year there were 300 startups, and what they did is they gave us a real data set of 100,000 customers, which we anonymized and put into this sandbox. So really nice way to test with real data, anonymized, but real data, what the developers can do. And then, with some of these guys, you can move into production and pilots and so on. BBVA is another good example, not customers of ours, but really leader in this in this API kind of world. Interestingly, what they offer out of the box is this core APIs I was talking about, so access to account, payments, and so on. Another example, also not a customer of ours, Capital One in the US. So that's interesting because their approach is slightly different. They don't offer these core APIs. They offer sort of particular APIs to them. So typically a reward, so like loyalty point APIs. That's not really critical to the business. So it's maybe easier to provide as a first step, right? And then build momentum for the program. So that's another approach. They have like credit offers. This is something they do already online. They just put an API, nice API on top of it. So this is also another approach. So either you go with these core APIs, Or if you want to build momentum first internally, you can cherry pick the kind of low-hanging fruit and deploy that through APIs. What do we have? Yeah, so City is another example here. We're not talking about core APIs, but they have a really nice program with Qantas, City from Singapore, where they white labeled the credit cards and mobile app for Qantas. So, and basically this is all driven by API. So if you take a credit card from Qantas, it's all using the creation of that card and so on. It's all driven by API, Citibank APIs. And now Citi is scaling that program to other airlines in the region. So really interesting use case, again, outside this core transactions and payments and so on, right? So it's not just about that. This is really interesting as well. Solaris Bank, not sure if you've heard of it, but it's a German bank, but they say we're a software company with a bank license. So this is a bank which has no branch, no mobile app, no online banking, nothing. It's just a set of APIs and a banking license, and they offer their services to third parties. So if you're today in Europe and you want to build a bank for, I don't know, SMEs, for instance, instead of applying for a license and so on, you can go to these guys and very quickly you have access to their APIs and you can build your banking proposition on top of that. And this is a model which we see also coming. I don't think, all the banks will become like that, but we'll definitely see more of these sort of propositions where, the bank is just a layer of APIs and then others come and consume it, right? And that's probably a threat for traditional incumbent banks. But again, this is all driven 100% by APIs. So that's for the sort of case studies. I guess I want to finish on that one. Is how do we start, right? Okay, this is all interesting, but how do we start? I think you obviously need senior management buy-in, commitment. You need, I believe, a use case to start on the journey. You need potential partners you want to work with. So if your use case is an AI or a chatbot, or what are the kind of potential chatbots you want to work with? And then you need also to be ready from a technical perspective, right? And one thing we've been doing a lot and proved quite successful in sort of getting the senior management commitment and getting that use case and potential partners is basically to run this sort of process, right? So first, to engage internally. Oh, that's a pity. That was a funny GIF here, so it's not working. So basically, engage internally, right? Try to understand and get buy-in from different stakeholders. What this should have said is there was a guy dancing, and then there were more guys dancing, and then there's the whole group dancing, right? So I think it always starts with few pioneers, some of whom I think in this room today. So start with some pioneers, and then you get more support and more support and more support. Have a sandbox, really key. Can't put an emphasis on that. So basically, a sandbox is really a test environment, right? So, and it's important. It's important for the developers, right, to get something from you. Okay, what does it mean to have APIs? They want to test it, and it's also important internally because it helps you. So APIs is a technical, kind of complicated topic, but it helps you get the business message. It helps you make it more tangible. It helps when people see apps connected to your API portal, right? It does bring lots of value when changing people's mindset. Once you have a sandbox, also what works really well is having these hackathon events. So a hackathon is typically 2 days event. It's really nice. So you have a sandbox, you bring some business challenges, some problem statements from some of your colleagues, and you get people to come together and build new proposition around these problem statements, to address this problem statement. So typically how it works, it's a 2 days event. We come all together in a room on Friday. The bank offers the sandbox and the problems. The people, the participants starts pitching ideas. They have the weekend to build these ideas, to build working prototypes. So it's not just ideas and PowerPoints, it's real working apps in the end, prototypes. They have mentors throughout the weekend, so people from the bank who comes and help them shape their proposition, kind of exchange ideas. Again, really important in terms of culture change and onboarding different stakeholders from the different business units. They have food and it's fun. It's kind of it's fun, and then in the end, they pitch their ideas, they present their ideas and their prototypes to a senior panel of judges, and there are winners, and we give them an award, and everyone is happy. And it's really nice also to involve senior leadership. Like typically, you would have a CIO sitting in the jury panel, and they come. So a CIO would come, let's say Friday, they see people pitching ideas, and comes back on Sunday and see actual working prototypes of these ideas, and that really makes something in their mind. It helps understand that the way we build software today, thanks to API, has radically changed, and it's really a different way of doing things. And then, of course, you can follow up afterwards. You could do, depending on the bank, you could do POCs, pilots. You can do, you can put them into an incubator. You can buy some of them. I don't know. You can do nothing as well. But it's really a way to engage internally as much as externally, and identify those partners you want. Maybe in a year's time, maybe in 2 years' time, you would identify those partners you might go into production with. So that's pretty much what I had for you today. So again, let's not forget about the sort of life cycle. I think it needs to start. You need to find the sort of right use case for this. The use case could be regulation and industry. So like here today, Payment NZ is obviously leading an API pilot. So the use case could be, we have to do this because there is the API pilot and we need to comply with that. So how do we do it, right? So design your APIs. Sometimes you don't need to design the APIs, actually. You can reuse existing standards. So we talked about Open Bank project, we talked about the UK Open Banking. So there are things existing, and Payments NZ is using, is building the NZ standard. So whenever there is standard, I think it's good to not reinvent the wheel and use that. However, keep in mind, as we were saying, there's a lot of things to open up. These standards tend to focus on access to account and transaction and payment, but there is a lot more you can open up. When building, you have different perspective on doing that. Really see what works best for you. For security, for authentication, at least I think OAuth is or OpenID Connect are the clear winners. And then when operating your API, think about the developer experience. Think about getting these APIs that you have, even however simple they are, think about getting them in front of customers and in front of developers so they can give you feedback. And think of how you can support them in being productive. I think that's the key question here. Some of the lessons learned, I shared that yesterday as well. So treat your API as product. I talked about that, super important. Do not wait for the fine print of the regulation. Also, again, really important. You should be experimenting already. You should be doing experimentation, understanding what developers want. Again, as we said, we don't really know what they need or what they want. So the only way to figure out is to experiment, to offer something, see if they like it or not, and improve and start a conversation. You need to be engaging with third-party partners already, right, to see what's the art of possible? Should I have APIs? What can emerge out of that? So I think you should be engaging. And again, hackathons, sandboxes, these are really good ways to do it. You should be planning a route to production. So it's really bad if you just have an API portal, people can register and then they stop. They wait 1 year, 2 years for you to get back to them. So when you start this journey, you should also in parallel have, start like basically doing it seriously. Like how can we get access to data? So you should be engaging with the technical team, the business teams. You should have a plan to go to production at some point being discussed. And you need to be agile. And I always say that we do not have the answers. This is new. This is why it's fun, I guess. This is why we like it, because we don't have the answers. It's not something procedural where we do this, and that, and we win. No, it's, we figure things out as we go. So I think it's really important to have an agile mindset and to try things and see, incorporate feedback and move along. Why Open Bank project? Particularly assuming you are interested in open banking, you want to go that route. Open Bank project is unique in the sense where it provides you with acceleration. So it's speed to market. There's a discrete solution that you plug to your systems, gives you that sort of speed to market. It gives you exposure. We have already 160 APIs you can reuse and you can extend, and we have 9,000 developers who are keen to work with you, who can, who've built apps already that can add value to your end customers. So particularly if you are a small bank or in a small market where there aren't tons of fintech, Open Bank project gives you access to fintech not only in New Zealand but outside as well, and it de-risked the project, right? So we've been doing this for a long time now. It worked quite successfully with other banks, so it can work with you as well. And that's pretty much it for me, 2 hours of talking. Just wanted to finish on this kind of list of questions that you might want to have to keep in mind. What's our strategic approach? Do we want to comply purely, or do we want to innovate more? And again, you can pure compliance is a valid strategic approach, but I think what's really important is to figure out where do we sit, because the approach is different afterwards. Do we have a sandbox? Do we have a route to production? What's the KPIs for the program? Have we started engaging with startups, with third-party developers and potential partners? I think it's a key question. What are the use cases? What are the assets we're going to open up? Is it just the core access to payment and transaction? Is it something else that makes sense for us that would differentiate us from the bank next door? So some of the questions, there are more. I think we have a few minutes, 5 minutes more, so if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. Thank you very much. Any questions? Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about 2FA and especially transactions, payments?
Sure. So the model we follow, so the question was, can I talk a bit more about second factor authentication? And how it works in relation to payment particularly. The model we follow with the Open Bank project, and we think is a good one, is the PSD2 RTS model. And basically the RTS, that's what the RTS calls the strong customer authentication. And the RTS, so RTS is the kind of technical standard for PSD2. And they specify when you should do second factor authentication. And there are a certain number of rules. So I mentioned if it's over 30 euros, that you should do it. If you can do 5 payments without this second factor authentication, but after the 5th you need to renew it. There are certain lists of constraints. There are also exemptions. So, and I think that's also important. So, if you do, so for instance, if you park your car or travel, you don't have to do second factor authentication, so it's kind of more convenient. The problem with second factor authentication is basically convenience, right? So it kind of hinders the convenience of the whole experience. So you want to do it as little as possible, but at the same time you want to do it because it ensures the security of the transactions, right? And particularly for payment. So our view aligns very, very much with what the RTS says. And how the RTS describes it.
So you're basically ranking your app developer. So if it comes from a parking institution, they are excluded from 2FA, but if they come from just a normal developer, 2FA comes into play.
Yes, but there are conditions to that as well. Is it over 50 euros or so or not? Is it the 5th transaction this customer has done without 2FA or not? So there's a list of actions or if then kind of statements to be gone through.
Sorry, so on that,
yeah.
Where does those rules sit inside the Open Bank project?
It's in this middleware layer basically.
Because it's normally delegated off to an identity and access management server of sorts. So that's kind of taking that role.
Sorry, can you say it again?
The identity and access management portion of the Open Bank project.
Yeah.
It's built into the OAuth server.
So we have an OAuth server which we've built, but it's kind of it's modular, right? So if a bank has its own OAuth server, that's fine, we can use it. If a bank is using actually an API gateway, we can connect to that as well, and you can use the API gateway of or the OAuth module of the gateway as well. However, that module, that OAuth server, will always connect to your identification server, right? It'll always go back and authenticate against the bank.
So how are you stepping up that authentication? What's enforcing that in the Open Bank? The OpenID Connect, how are those transaction flows getting engaged?
So typically a bank wouldn't offer an OAuth server today, right? Like I guess most banks. So what we offer them is this. So the OAuth server, which will handle the interaction with the app. So as I was saying before, when you're using an Open Bank project enabled app, so it says, like, let's say connect, it shows you the this OAuth server, right? You have to log in. When you log in, the OAuth server will identify you as a customer against the identification system of the bank, the normal identification system of the bank, and then it will give that token back to the app. Without using the OAuth server, you won't be able to do this tokenization, kind of transaction, right?
So step up, you would use that token, the server would come back and say no, you ramp up your authentication, go back to authentication.
Yes, exactly. And the token can be, as I was saying, it has a duration, it has a particular app, it's for a particular app and a particular user, right? And it has a scope of services as well. What we also do is we do this role-based access. So you can define roles for different type of users. So for instance, you can say, these users, or by default, everyone has a read-only access, but only the type of partners you specify have a payment initiation access. So you can define this role, and then even if the customer gives the consent, if the partner doesn't have the right role, then the transaction wouldn't happen. Yeah.
I just want to get a sense of scale of effort to implement. So assuming a bank was going to adopt your framework.
Yeah.
And let's say we're just talking about the core APIs you mentioned, accounts, transactions, payments. Assuming they're reasonably well positioned internally around internal APIs, what scale of effort do you usually find is required to implement?
So again, it's a really tough question to answer. I think the right answer is it depends. It depends on, as you said, the scope of APIs the bank wants to open. It depends on the technology they have as well, right? Like how ready technology-wise. If you have SOAP interfaces, if you can expose some SOAP interfaces to us, and you're able to expose, the scope is just this kind of core APIs we talked about, then typically it takes 3 months to do the actual integration, a month or so to do the, sometimes the banks wants to do, most of the time the banks wants to do a POC to start with, and then there's a security phase of running penetration testing and so on and so forth. So for a typical process would be 5 to 6 months. Again, for this very limited scope of APIs, and assuming you have SOAP interfaces, or assuming you have a core banking that we already know.
In a previous company I worked with, we did integrate with many different apps. It was quite a big ecosystem, and probably the reason why our users didn't connect to many apps was because the proposition was not good. But I'm interested to know your experience if users feel insecure or feel that they can't really trust an app to connect to their bank. Have you had any experience with something like that?
Sure. So, I mean, there is a study in the UK about that, actually, and the results weren't really really nice. I think most of the responded, they asked UK citizens if they trusted open banking, if they liked open banking, and so on. And most people were saying they didn't trust that program or they didn't know actually about it. So I think there is a big risk there for sure. But I think the problem with it is that for a long time, banks were telling their customers, do not use third-party applications. And now suddenly they're saying, oh, actually use third-party applications. So I think the approach the bank goes towards this is important. Also, when you take this survey, the questions were about open banking. Do you trust open banking? Well, no one cares about open banking. What they care about is the service behind it, right? So, do you care about having a PFM solution for your kids to learn how to manage money? Well, maybe people would say more yes to that. So I think the approach is essential. It's definitely a risk that no one uses it. We see it in the UK. So engaging with the end users, the customer, is important. Things like hackathons might help with that as well. Yeah.
If I'm a potential third party or a partner that processes payments on behalf of my customers, and my customers could be banking on different banks, does that mean that I have to establish a direct partnership with multiple banks?
So again, here it depends. It depends on what's how is open banking kind of implemented, right? So you might do that, but in different other cases, you have so I talked about this API hub. So you'll have like a one-stop shop, so you connect to one-stop shop, and then that instance connects you to the different bank. I think here in New Zealand there's something called Greenbase trying to do a similar model, but the answer is it depends.
Basically, I'm talking about this in the context of a potential alternative for third-party like credit card payment service, because in a credit card payment service in New Zealand, I think the main provider is DPS. Mm-hmm. So if I have to look at an alternative like using this open banking API, then that means that I have to be able to connect to almost every bank in New Zealand so I can service a majority of my clients then.
So again, it depends. If you have an alternative, you might well have an alternative giving you access to all the banks, then you can just go through these guys. It depends, right? It depends on what the regulatory framework says. Maybe the regulatory framework doesn't allow that. Maybe the regulatory framework forces you to connect to every bank. I think, it depends. But not necessarily you would go through each bank. Not necessarily.
Can you talk about monetization versus open banking?
Sure. I wouldn't put it versus, so it I think you can make money out of open banking. It's not either or. I think it's really case by case for now. There is no one sort of model fits all. So let's say maybe there are three types. There's the free model, and the free model is, in most cases, it's the regulator saying, oh, it needs to be free, so you should keep that in mind. There is, kind of pay per transaction kind of model, and then there is a model where open banking is just a nicer way to deliver a service which has been delivered before. So I talked about Capital One and their credit offers. This is something they do online already, so they just put a nice API on top of that, and there is referral programs already in place and so on. So they don't charge for the API itself, but the API drives traffic to something they charge for. So that's also interesting. But again, you need to think through the use case here before being able to say. But other than that, so as I said, you can pay per transactions. But to be honest, we haven't seen yet many API programs which charge for the transactions. In most cases, it's given away for free. There's maybe a fourth model, which is white labeling, which is also very, very much a valid one, right? You can use these APIs to attract talent, and then in the terms and condition, you could say, hey, if you want to use our applications, we like what you do, but we need to do revenue sharing, or we need to do white labeling or something like that, or co-branding, or So I think it's all up for grab and to be designed. Yeah.
Thank you, Ismail. It's been a really interesting session.
Thanks.
I just wanted to know how many banks
So about 40 bank customers.
Well, in Europe?
So mostly Europe, but we also have customers in the US. So we mostly Europe, vast majority in Europe, then Middle East, then Australia and the US. But like, yeah, mostly Europe.
Is there any lessons learned from the European agencies, and are they targeting a set of future versions or upcoming changes?
From like a regulator perspective, you mean? It's interesting. I think for me the big lesson is the question you asked before, which is like we should have been reaching out to end customers earlier on, and we should have been able to take their feedback on and onboard them and kind of win their trust. So I think that's for me what's the big lessons. When it comes to PSD3, the next version, I'm not sure. I think we would need to have more time. I think also what's the right authorization level to enable fintech to come into play, right? So you might have. So if your stated objective for this program is to drive innovation, right? But you have super high barriers to entry for fintech to come in. So you can't let the innovators come, but it's just established business. So that's a problem. That defeats the purpose of the program, right? So I think finding the right balance for that authorization process is something important. I think the next versions will also be about who opens the data. Is it just the banks? Is it the fintech as well? So like who's going to share? Is it just the bank sharing their data or not? I think there's also a question. What to share? Maybe extending the scope of the program. So if you take PSD2, it talks about access to current account, right? If you take the Australian program, which came later on, it talks about mortgage account, deposit account, this and that, right? So the scope is getting bigger as well. I think that's what we will see in future versions as well. And yeah, I think particularly in Europe, what we will see as well is a convergence with another regulatory push, which is GDPR. So it's the data privacy law in Europe. So I think it will need to, like today there are some clashes with PSD2. So I think in the next version they will be harmonized, basically, these two. Yep.
Is the basis for that because the banks in New Zealand seem to implement their service architectures using that technology set, or did you have another driver?
It's because it's less worse than the other available options. It's more modern than other options, and no, I don't think it doesn't have to do anything in New Zealand. So SOAP was like kind of a standard at some point, right, in the last few years, and it's easier to consume. And most of the banks we work with, they have this kind of SOAP interfaces. So we've built our expertise mainly on that type of architecture. Any further questions?
A lot of the documentation and stuff that you showed had open banking project, sort of like trademark over it. Would if a bank chooses to go with you guys, would the branding be still open banking or?
Oh no, it's completely white labeled. It's branded for you guys.
Including all the URLs and everything.
Including all the URLs and everything. If you do a sandbox with us and you want to do it fast, we would host it for you, and then it will be under an Open Bank project URL. If you want to do it on your own systems, then it's fine as well, and the URL wouldn't mention Open Bank project. Any? Oh yeah.
Sorry.
No worries.
I get the impression that the open banking API, the risk
Mm-hmm.
Walking the tree, if you like, of objects, account user transactions. Any advice on a pattern where you may have a large volume of information that needs to be shown?
Sure. So we do have APIs for that as well, like sort of data analytics. That's what we call data analytics APIs. So I think there is something called GraphML, which is kind of I don't know, new and trendy when it comes to how do you say, requesting large amount of data, which has different relationship and stuff. So that might be something to look at, but really that's still in its infancy. Again, why REST is important today is because REST is mature. Probably 3-4 years ago, we wouldn't have. Like today, it's widely accepted as standard, and I think that's what we need for enterprise technology. So I would still advise, even if you have a large data set, and again, you can look at our API, how we've designed it for data analytics. I would still advise to have a REST model, but keep your eyes open, let's say, or I don't know how you want to say that, but like, yeah, keep looking at developments, particularly GraphML. I mean, that's what we do, but I don't think it's ready for prime time yet. And again, as I was saying, REST is good today, maybe not tomorrow. Just as SOAP was good, 10 years ago, but maybe not today. Good. Do we? Oh, okay. All right. Well, I was like, oh, that's weird. Any last question? Are we good? All right. Good. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much.